before Moses ever stood before kings, before the sea ever split in two, before fire burned on the mountain without consuming it, he was nothing more than a fragile child hidden in a world that wanted him dead. Egypt was the most powerful empire on earth. Its temples reached toward the sky like stone mountains. Its armies marched across deserts and rivers, and its pharaoh ruled with a power that few dared question. But beneath that power was fear, and fear has a way of turning rulers into tyrants. The Israelites had lived in Egypt for generations. What began as refuge had slowly become captivity. They had multiplied greatly, their families growing large, their communities spreading across the land. At first, this growth seemed harmless, but as years passed, the Egyptians began to see them not as guests, but as a threat. Pharaoh looked at the numbers and saw danger. If enemies ever attacked Egypt, he feared the Israelites might join them and rise against the empire from within. Fear whispered to him day and night until it hardened into cruelty. So Pharaoh made a decision that would echo through history. He enslaved them. The Israelites were forced into brutal labor. Day after day they molded bricks under the burning Egyptian sun. They built store cities, temples, and monuments that glorified the very empire that oppressed them. Their backs bent under heavy loads, their hands blistered from endless work, and their cries rose into the desert sky. Yet even under oppression they continued to grow, and that terrified Pharaoh even more. So he issued a command darker than slavery. Every Hebrew baby boy that was born was to be thrown into the Nile River. The Nile was Egypt's lifeline. Its waters fed crops, filled canals, and sustained cities. But under Pharaoh's command, it became a river of death. Soldiers began searching homes. Midwives were ordered to report births. Mothers lived in constant fear, knowing that the cry of a newborn son could bring soldiers to their door. In the midst of this terror, a woman from the tribe of Levi gave birth to a boy. The moment she saw him, she knew two things. He was beautiful and he was in danger. For 3 months she hid him. Every cry had to be silenced quickly. Every visitor was watched carefully. Every night she prayed that no Egyptian official would come searching. But babies grow, and eventually hiding became impossible. She knew the soldiers would find him, so she did something desperate. Something that required both courage and faith. She built a small basket from papyrus reeds. Carefully she coated it with tar and pitch so that water could not seep through. The basket became like a tiny boat, fragile but watertight. Then she placed the child inside. Imagine the weight of that moment. A mother placing her baby into a river known for crocodiles, currents, and the possibility that the basket might never be seen again. But perhaps she believed something deeper. Perhaps she believed that if she could not protect her son, God could. The morning sun reflected off the waters of the Nile as she carried the basket to the riverbank. Her daughter followed silently behind, watching every movement with wide eyes. The mother placed the basket gently among the reeds where the water was calm. For a moment she lingered, then she stepped away. The river began carrying the basket slowly along the edge of the reeds. The sister stayed nearby, hidden, watching carefully to see what would happen. Not far away, something unexpected was unfolding. Pharaoh's daughter had come down to the river to bathe. Royal attendants stood nearby as she walked along the water's edge. The daughter of Pharaoh lived in luxury far beyond anything the Hebrew slaves could imagine. But even royalty sometimes notices the smallest things. Among the reeds, she saw something strange. A basket. Curiosity pulled her closer. She ordered one of her servants to bring it. When the lid was opened, the child inside began to cry. That sound changed everything. The princess immediately understood what she was looking at. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. She knew her father's command. She knew that boys like this were meant to die in the river. But something stronger than politics stirred in her heart. Compassion. At that exact moment, the hidden sister stepped forward with remarkable courage. "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" she asked. Pharaoh's daughter agreed. The girl ran quickly, straight back to her mother. And in one of history's most beautiful ironies, the child's own mother was hired by Pharaoh's household to raise him. For several years the boy grew under the care of the woman who had given him life. She fed him, held him, and whispered stories into his ears about the God of their ancestors, about Abraham, about Isaac, about Jacob, about the promises that God had made long ago. Eventually the time came for the child to be brought to Pharaoh's daughter permanently. She adopted him as her own son, and she gave him a name, Moses. "Because I drew him out of the water," she said. The name carried meaning deeper than she could possibly know, because one day Moses would draw an entire nation out of the waters of the sea. Years passed. Moses grew up in the palace of Egypt. He was educated with the finest training available in the most advanced civilization of the ancient world. He learned languages, mathematics, military strategy, politics, and the complex religious systems of Egypt. He wore royal clothing. He walked through halls lined with golden statues. Servants bowed as he passed. To the outside world, he appeared to be an Egyptian prince, but somewhere inside him lived another identity. The stories his mother had told him never disappeared. He knew who his people were. He knew the suffering they endured. And one day that knowledge became impossible to ignore. Moses was about 40 years old when something happened that changed the direction of his life forever. He went out to observe the labor of the Hebrew slaves. What he saw was brutality. An Egyptian overseer was beating a Hebrew worker mercilessly. The slave had little strength left, but the whip continued to fall. Moses looked around. No one was watching. In that moment, anger surged through him like fire. Years of hidden frustration exploded. He struck the Egyptian. The blow was fatal. The overseer collapsed lifeless into the dust. Realizing what he had done, Moses quickly buried the body in the sand. But violence has a way of revealing itself. The next day Moses returned and saw two Hebrew men fighting each other, hoping to restore peace. He stepped in. "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" he asked. The man turned toward him with suspicion. "Who made you ruler and judge over us?" he replied. "Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" The words hit Moses like a hammer. His secret was known. And if the slaves knew, Pharaoh would soon know as well. Fear replaced anger. Moses realized he had just become a fugitive in the most powerful empire on earth. When Pharaoh heard what happened, he ordered Moses to be killed. The prince became an outlaw overnight. So Moses fled. He ran far beyond the borders of Egypt, across deserts and wilderness, until he finally reached a land called Midian. The palace was gone. The luxury was gone. The identity he had known his entire life was gone. And there in the quiet wilderness, Moses began a completely different life. He became a shepherd. The man who had once walked marble halls now walked dusty hills guiding sheep. Days turned into years. Years turned into decades. 40 years passed in silence. To the world it must have looked like Moses' story was finished, a prince who became a murderer. A fugitive who disappeared into the desert, a life that started with miracles but ended in obscurity. But heaven had not forgotten Moses. Far away in Egypt, the suffering of the Israelites continued. Their cries for deliverance rose higher and higher. And one day, in the lonely wilderness, a strange fire would appear on a mountain, a fire that would burn without consuming the bush. And when Moses stepped closer to investigate, he would hear a voice that would shake the foundation of his life, a voice calling his name from the flames. "Moses, Moses." And the shepherd who thought his story was over would suddenly realize that it was only just beginning. 40 years passed in the wilderness of Midian, and during those long quiet decades the name of Moses slowly faded from the memory of Egypt. The prince who once walked the halls of Pharaoh's palace had become a shepherd among rocky hills and endless desert wind. The man who had been educated in the wisdom of Egypt now spent his days guiding sheep across dry valleys and lonely mountain paths. The palace, the power, the identity he once knew, all of it seemed like a distant dream from another lifetime. At first the silence of the wilderness must have felt like exile. Moses had once believed he could change the fate of his people with a single act of courage. Instead, that act had turned him into a fugitive. Egypt had rejected him, and even his own people had questioned him. Years earlier he had tried to become a deliverer through strength and anger, but the result had been failure and fear. Now the desert had become his teacher. The wilderness has a way of stripping away illusions. Day after day Moses walked beneath the same blazing sun, listening to the same quiet wind sweeping across the sand. There were no crowds there, no applause, no titles, no royal identity. Only silence, only patience, only time. In Midian, Moses had found a new life. He had married Zipporah, the daughter of a priest named Jethro. He had children. He built a family and a home far removed from the chaos of Egypt. Yet even as the years passed peacefully, something deeper still lived within him, the memory of his people, the Hebrews who still labored under the whips of Egyptian masters, sometimes at night, perhaps while watching the stars scatter across the black desert sky. Moses must have remembered the cries he heard from the slaves. Perhaps he wondered if God had forgotten them. Perhaps he wondered if the promises spoken to Abraham centuries earlier had simply faded into history. But heaven had not forgotten. One day Moses led his flock far into the wilderness, beyond the familiar grazing lands, toward the rugged slopes of a mountain known as Horeb. The land there was wild and quiet, a place where jagged rocks rose from the earth like ancient ruins carved by wind and time. The mountain stood silent against the sky, its dark slopes untouched by the noise of cities or the ambitions of kings. As Moses guided the sheep across the dry ground, something unusual caught his eye. At first it seemed like an ordinary flame. A bush had caught fire. In the desert this was not entirely strange. Lightning sometimes struck dry shrubs, and the intense heat could ignite brittle branches. But this fire was different. The bush was burning, yet it was not being consumed. The flames danced and flickered across its branches, glowing bright against the dry wilderness air. Yet the leaves did not curl, the branches did not crumble into ash. The fire continued burning, steady and alive, but the bush remained whole. Moses stopped walking. He stared at the strange sight in confusion. In all his years in the desert, he had never seen anything like it. Fire destroys, fire devours, but this fire was alive without destroying the thing it touched. Curiosity slowly pulled him closer. "I will go over and see this strange sight," he said quietly to himself. "Why the bush does not burn up." Step by step Moses walked toward the fire. The wind moved gently through the rocks. The sheep wandered nearby. The flames continued dancing across the branches as if they were alive. Then something happened that would change the course of history. A voice came from the fire. Moses, Moses, the sound of his name coming from the burning bush must have frozen him in place. This was no ordinary fire. This was no natural event. The voice carried a weight that filled the air itself, as if the desert had suddenly become sacred ground. Moses answered with trembling words. Here I am. The voice spoke again, calm yet powerful. Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. In that moment Moses realized what he was experiencing. This was not merely a mysterious fire. This was the presence of the living God. The desert ground beneath his feet, dust and stone that had existed unnoticed for centuries, had suddenly become holy because God was there. Moses quickly removed his sandals. Then the voice continued. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At those words Moses covered his face. He was afraid to look at God. The stories his mother once told him as a child came rushing back to life. The God who had spoken to Abraham, who had made promises to their ancestors, who had guided their history, he was now speaking directly from the fire before him. Then God spoke words that revealed something profound. I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their suffering. For generations the Israelites had cried out in pain. It must have felt to them as if heaven had remained silent. But God revealed that he had seen everything, every whip, every tear, every desperate prayer rising from the enslaved nation. I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, God said, and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, land flowing with milk and honey. Moses listened in stunned silence. Deliverance was coming. Freedom was coming. But the next words from the fire would shake him deeply. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh so that you may bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. The command must have struck Moses like thunder. Return to Egypt, stand before Pharaoh. The same Pharaoh who had once ordered his death. The same empire he had fled from in fear 40 years earlier. Moses immediately felt the weight of the task and his own weakness. Who am I, he asked, that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? It was a question born from humility and fear. Moses remembered his failure years earlier. He remembered the rejection of his people and the power of Egypt. He was no longer a prince. He was a shepherd in the desert. But God's answer did not focus on Moses. I will be with you. That promise changed everything. Deliverance would not depend on Moses' strength or ability. It would depend on God's presence. Still, Moses struggled to believe it. His mind raced with doubts. What if I go to the Israelites and say, the God of your fathers has sent me, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I tell them? The desert wind whispered softly across the rocks as the fire continued burning. Then God spoke one of the most powerful declarations ever recorded. I am who I am. The words carried a depth beyond human understanding. God was not merely another deity among many. He was the eternal one, the self-existing God who depended on nothing and no one. Say this to the Israelites, God continued. I am has sent me to you. Then God gave Moses a clear message for the people. The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever. The fire continued to burn brightly as God revealed the plan. Moses would gather the elders of Israel and tell them that God had seen their suffering. Then he would go to Pharaoh and demand that the Israelites be allowed to leave Egypt. But God also warned Moses of the difficulty ahead. Pharaoh would not listen easily. His heart would be hardened. Miracles would be required. Signs of divine power would shake Egypt itself before the king would finally release the slaves. Moses listened carefully, but fear still lingered in his heart. What if the people refused to believe him? What if Pharaoh laughed? What if everything failed again like it had 40 years earlier? But the burning bush still burned, untouched by destruction, and the voice of God remained steady. The shepherd who once thought his story was finished was now being called into a destiny far greater than anything he had imagined. The quiet desert years had not been wasted. They had prepared him, because the man who would stand before Pharaoh could not be the proud prince raised in Egyptian luxury. He had to become something else, a man shaped by silence, a man who understood weakness, a man who had learned that power does not come from the palace, but from the presence of God. And soon Moses would discover that standing before God in the desert was only the beginning, because the next step would require him to walk back into the heart of Egypt and confront the most powerful king in the world. And when that moment came, the battle would not merely be between Moses and Pharaoh, it would be between the gods of Egypt and the living God who spoke from the fire. The fire still burned within the bush, bright and steady against the dark stones of Mount Horeb. The desert wind moved softly across the mountain, but the flames did not flicker as ordinary fire would. It burned with a life that did not depend on wood or air, and before it stood Moses barefoot on holy ground, overwhelmed by the voice of the God of his ancestors. God had spoken clearly. The suffering of Israel had been seen. Their cries had been heard. Deliverance was coming. But the deliverer was the man standing there in the dust, holding nothing more than a shepherd's staff. Moses listened to the command, yet doubt still wrestled inside his heart. The memory of Egypt had not faded. Pharaoh's power was enormous. Egypt ruled with armies, wealth, and gods worshipped by millions. And Moses knew something else that troubled him deeply. The Israelites themselves might not believe him. He had tried once before to stand for them, and they had rejected him. So Moses spoke again, his voice cautious. "What if they do not believe me?" he asked, "or listen to my voice? What if they say, 'The Lord did not appear to you'?" The question revealed the deep insecurity within him. Moses was not afraid only of Pharaoh. He feared being dismissed, doubted or mocked by the very people he was sent to rescue. The fire glowed brighter as the voice of God answered with patience. "What is that in your hand?" Moses looked down at the object he had carried every day for years. "A staff," he replied. It was a simple shepherd's staff, worn smooth from long use in the wilderness. With it he guided sheep, defended them from wild animals, and leaned upon it during long journeys across rocky ground. It was the tool of an ordinary man. God then gave a command: "Throw it on the ground." Moses released the staff and it fell onto the dry earth. The moment it touched the ground, something impossible happened. The wooden staff twisted, shifted, and came alive. It transformed into a living serpent, coiling across the dirt with sudden movement. Moses jumped back in fear. For anyone raised in Egypt, the image of a serpent carried deep meaning. Serpents were symbols of power, authority, and divine protection for Pharaoh himself. The cobra even appeared on the crown of Egyptian kings. Yet here in the wilderness, before the presence of God, Moses watched as the staff in his hand had become a living creature. Then God spoke again. "Reach out your hand and take it by the tail." The command must have felt terrifying. Anyone who knows snakes understands the danger of grabbing one by the tail. It could turn instantly and strike. But Moses obeyed. Slowly, cautiously, he reached forward and grabbed the tail of the serpent. The moment his hand closed around it, the creature stiffened and changed again. It became a staff once more. The wood lay in his hand exactly as it had before. The miracle had lasted only seconds, yet the meaning was unmistakable. God was showing Moses that the ordinary could become extraordinary when placed in his hands. "This," God said, "is so that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has appeared to you." But the signs were not finished. God gave another command: "Put your hand inside your cloak." Moses slipped his hand inside the fold of his robe against his chest. When he pulled it out again, he gasped in horror. His hand had turned white with disease. The skin had become pale and lifeless, infected with leprosia, a terrifying illness that slowly destroyed the body and forced people into isolation. A man with leprosy could no longer live among his family or community. For a moment, Moses stared at his own hand, shocked by the sudden transformation. Then God spoke again. "Put your hand back inside your cloak." Moses obeyed quickly. When he pulled his hand out once more, the disease had vanished. His skin was restored, healthy as before. 2 miracles, 2 signs. God continued explaining, "If they do not believe the first sign, they may believe the second. But if they still do not listen, take some water from the Nile River and pour it onto the dry ground. The water will become blood." The signs were powerful and unmistakable. They would demonstrate that the God of Israel had authority not only over nature but over Egypt itself. The Nile River was the lifeline of Egypt, worshipped and honored as a divine source of life. To turn its water into blood would be a direct challenge to the gods of Pharaoh's land. Yet even with these miracles promised, Moses still hesitated. The problem now moved deeper. It was not only fear of rejection or disbelief, it was fear of himself. Moses spoke again, revealing another weakness that had haunted him for years. "Please, Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." The man who once lived in the palace of Egypt now confessed that he felt incapable of speaking. Perhaps the years in the desert had stripped away his confidence. Perhaps the pressure of confronting Pharaoh felt overwhelming. Standing before kings requires courage, but it also requires words. Moses feared he did not have them. But God answered with a question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. Who gave human beings their mouths? The words carried quiet authority. Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? God was reminding Moses of something profound. Human weakness does not limit divine power. "Now go," God said. "I will help you speak and will teach you what to say." The promise was clear. God himself would guide Moses' words, but Moses' fear had grown heavy. The weight of the mission seemed unbearable. And in one final moment of hesitation, Moses spoke again. "Please, Lord, send someone else." It was an honest confession. Despite the miracles, despite the promises, despite the burning bush itself, Moses still felt unable to carry the responsibility. For a moment, the mountain stood silent. Then the scripture reveals something rare and powerful. The anger of the Lord burned against Moses, not because Moses was weak, but because he continued resisting the calling placed upon him. Still, even in that moment of divine frustration, God showed mercy. "Is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite?" God said, "I know that he can speak well. He is already on his way to meet you, and he will be glad to see you." God then explained the plan. Aaron would speak to the people, Moses would speak to Aaron, and God would speak to Moses. The message would flow from heaven, through Moses, through Aaron, to the nation of Israel. "You will speak to him and put words in his mouth," God said. "I will help both of you speak and will teach you what to do." Aaron would become the voice. Moses would become the one through whom God worked, and the staff, the simple shepherd's staff, would become the instrument through which God performed wonders. "Take this staff in your hand," God said finally, "so you can perform the signs with it." The fire in the bush still burned, but the moment of decision had arrived. The shepherd who had lived quietly in the wilderness for 40 years now carried the responsibility of confronting the greatest empire of the ancient world. Moses picked up the staff, the same staff that had turned into a serpent, the same staff that would soon stretch over rivers, seas, and nations. The mountain wind whispered across Horeb as the encounter with God came to an end. But Moses' life had been permanently changed. The man who once fled Egypt as a murderer would now return as the messenger of the living God, and soon, when Moses stepped again onto Egyptian soil, the power of Pharaoh would begin to shake, because the next chapter would reveal a conflict unlike anything the world had ever seen. Not merely a battle between a king and a prophet, but a confrontation between the throne of Egypt and the God who spoke from the fire. The mountain of Horeb slowly faded behind Moses as he began the long journey back toward Egypt. The desert stretched endlessly before him, silent and vast, yet everything had changed. Only days earlier he had been a shepherd guiding sheep across lonely valleys. Now he carried a mission that would shake the greatest empire of the ancient world. In his hand was the staff. It looked ordinary, aged, wood-polished by years of use, but Moses could no longer see it as a simple tool. It had become the sign of something far greater. The staff represented the authority of the God who had spoken from the fire. Moses returned first to the tents of his father-in-law Jethro. The quiet life of Midian surrounded him, grazing flocks, desert wind, the familiar rhythm of shepherd life. Yet his heart was no longer settled there. He approached Jethro respectfully. "Let me return to my people in Egypt," Moses said. "I must see whether they are still alive." Jethro looked at the man who had lived among his family for many years. Moses had proven himself faithful and responsible. Whatever reason now called him away seemed serious. "Go in peace," Jethro answered. The blessing was simple, but it opened the path. Soon Moses gathered his wife Zipporah and his sons. They loaded their few belongings onto a donkey and began the long road toward the land Moses had once fled in fear. During the journey, the weight of God's words remained in Moses' mind. God had warned him that Pharaoh's heart would be hardened. The king of Egypt would not easily release the people who had built his cities and strengthened his empire. Deliverance would not come quietly. It would come through confrontation. As Moses traveled, God reminded him again of the seriousness of the mission. "You will perform before Pharaoh all the wonders I have given you the power to do," the Lord said. "But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go." The statement revealed something difficult to understand. Pharaoh's resistance was not merely political pride. His stubbornness would become part of a larger story, a demonstration of God's power over the gods and rulers of Egypt. Then God spoke words that carried both authority and warning. "Israel is my firstborn son," he declared. The message Moses would bring to Pharaoh was clear and bold. "Let my son go so that he may worship me." If Pharaoh refused, the consequences would be severe. But Moses had not yet stood before the king. First, he needed the one God had promised would help him speak, his brother Aaron. As Moses moved closer to Egypt, another journey was happening at the same time. God had spoken to Aaron as well, telling him to go into the wilderness to meet Moses. The two brothers had been separated for decades. Aaron had remained among the Israelites, living under the heavy labor imposed by Egypt. Moses had lived far away in the quiet wilderness of Midian. Now their paths crossed again. They met at the mountain of God. When Aaron saw Moses approaching, emotion filled the moment. The years apart suddenly collapsed into a single embrace. Moses kissed his brother, and the two stood together beneath the wide desert sky. Moses then told Aaron everything. He spoke about the burning bush that was not consumed. He repeated the words God had spoken. He described the mission, the miracles, the promise of deliverance. He showed Aaron the staff. Then Moses demonstrated the signs God had given him. The staff fell to the ground and became a serpent before Aaron's eyes. Moses picked it up again and it turned back into wood. He placed his hand inside his cloak, pulled it out diseased with leprosy, then restored it again. Aaron understood immediately. God had truly appeared. The time for deliverance had come. Together the brothers traveled toward the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived under Egyptian control. The closer they came, the heavier the air seemed to feel. Egypt was not just a powerful nation, it was a world of temples, armies, and rulers who believed themselves to be divine. When Moses and Aaron finally arrived among the elders of Israel, the people gathered to hear what these two men had to say. For generations, the Israelites had lived as slaves. They built cities for Pharaoh, labored under harsh overseers, and watched their children grow up in bondage. Many had begun to believe that freedom might never come, but that day something different entered the camp. Aaron spoke to the elders, repeating the words the Lord had given to Moses. He told them that God had seen their suffering and heard their cries. Deliverance was coming. Then Moses performed the signs. The staff became a serpent. The diseased hand became whole again. The elders stared in amazement. The God of their ancestors had not forgotten them. The scripture says something beautiful happened in that moment. The people believed. When they heard that the Lord had seen their misery and cared about their suffering, they bowed down and worshipped. For the first time in many years, the Israelites lifted their hearts toward heaven with hope. But the real challenge still remained. The king of Egypt, Pharaoh, was not merely a ruler. In Egyptian culture, he was seen as the living son of the gods, the supreme authority of the land. His word controlled armies, labor, and life itself. Yet Moses and Aaron now walked toward the palace with a message that directly challenged his power. They entered the presence of Pharaoh. The great halls of Egypt stood tall with towering columns and decorated walls that told stories of victories and divine kingship. Statues of gods and rulers watched silently as the two Hebrew brothers stood before the throne. Moses, once a prince of Egypt, now returned as a messenger of God. Aaron spoke the words that would ignite the conflict. "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." The command was simple, let them go. But Pharaoh's response revealed the arrogance of power. "Who is the Lord?" he asked coldly, "that I should obey him and let Israel go?" It was not just a question, it was a challenge. "I do not know the Lord," Pharaoh continued, "and I will not let Israel go." The statement echoed through the palace like a declaration of war. Moses and Aaron tried again. "The God of the Hebrews has met with us," they said. "Let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God." But Pharaoh had already decided. He saw their request not as a divine command, but as an excuse for laziness among the slaves. "You are distracting the people from their work," Pharaoh said sharply. Then he gave a cruel order that revealed the hardness of his heart. The Israelites would now be forced to produce the same number of bricks as before, but without receiving the straw needed to make them. The burden of slavery suddenly became even heavier. Egyptian overseers spread the command through the camps of Israel. Workers scattered across the land, searching desperately for straw among dry fields and broken stalks. The taskmasters beat them when they could not meet the impossible quotas. Pain replaced hope almost immediately. The Israelite foreman cried out to Pharaoh, begging for mercy, but Pharaoh accused them of laziness and refused to change the order. Soon the anger of the people turned toward Moses and Aaron. "You have made us a stench in Pharaoh's eyes," they said bitterly. "You have put a sword in his hand to kill us." The deliverer who had brought hope now faced rejection once again. Moses himself felt the weight of the moment crushing his spirit. He returned to the Lord in prayer. "Why, Lord?" he asked. "Why have you brought trouble on this people? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble on this people, and you have not rescued them at all." The mission seemed to be failing before it had even begun. The suffering of Israel had grown worse. Pharaoh remained unshaken, and Moses, the man chosen by God, felt once again like the uncertain shepherd he had been before the burning bush. But the story of deliverance had only begun, because the next time Moses stood before Pharaoh, the power of God would no longer come as simple signs. It would come as plagues that would shake the land of Egypt itself. The Nile would change, the skies would darken, the earth would tremble, and Pharaoh would slowly learn the answer to the question he had asked so arrogantly. Who is the Lord? Night settled over the camps of Israel like a heavy curtain. The fires burned low between the mud brick houses, and the air carried the sound of tired voices and weary bodies returning from impossible labor. The people had hoped that Moses would bring freedom. Instead, their suffering had grown worse. Pharaoh had tightened his grip, and the weight of slavery now pressed down harder than ever before. Moses walked alone that night. The voices of the people still echoed in his mind, their anger, their disappointment, their accusation that he had made their lives unbearable. The man who had returned with promises of deliverance now carried the burden of their frustration. He lifted his eyes toward the dark desert sky. "Lord," he had cried earlier, "why have you brought trouble on this people? Why did you send me?" But the answer of God had not been silence. It had been a promise. "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh." Those words carried a weight Moses could barely comprehend. The confrontation between a desert shepherd and the king of Egypt was about to become something far greater. This was no longer simply about the freedom of slaves. It was about the authority of God over the most powerful kingdom in the world. The next morning, Moses and Aaron once again approached the palace of Pharaoh. The city of Egypt stood proud and unshaken. Tall temples rose toward the sky. Priests moved through sacred courts, offering incense to their gods. Markets bustled with merchants and travelers. Soldiers guarded the gates, confident in the strength of their empire. Nothing in the streets suggested that this nation was about to face the judgment of heaven. Yet Moses walked forward with a staff in his hand. The same staff he had carried through the quiet hills of Midian now felt heavier, as if it held the weight of God's command. Aaron walked beside him, prepared once again to speak the words that had already angered the king. They entered Pharaoh's court. The ruler of Egypt sat upon his throne, surrounded by officials, priests, and magicians, the wise men who served the religious power of the empire. The hall was filled with symbols of Egyptian gods carved into stone and gold. Pharaoh's eyes narrowed when he saw the two Hebrews return. He had already dismissed them once. Their request had sounded foolish. Why would he release the labor force that built his cities? Why would the king of Egypt obey the command of a foreign god he did not recognize? But Moses and Aaron stood before him again. Aaron spoke first. "This is what the Lord says," he declared calmly. "Let my people go." Pharaoh leaned back slightly, unimpressed. "Show me a miracle," he replied coldly. The moment had arrived. Moses turned slightly toward Aaron, and Aaron raised the staff. With a single motion he threw it onto the stone floor of the royal court. The staff struck the ground, and instantly it began to move. Before the eyes of Pharaoh and his court, the staff twisted and transformed into a living serpent. Its body coiled and lifted from the ground, scales glistening beneath the palace lights. A murmur spread across the room, but Pharaoh did not panic. Instead, he gave a quiet command. The magicians of Egypt stepped forward. These men were trained in the secrets of Egyptian rituals and mystical arts. They had long served Pharaoh by performing signs that strengthened the belief that Egypt's gods held power over the world. One by one, they threw down their staffs. And astonishingly, their staffs also became serpents. For a moment, the room filled with moving coils across the polished floor. Pharaoh watched with a faint smile. The miracle Moses had presented did not seem unique after all. But then something unexpected happened. The serpent that had come from Aaron's staff moved suddenly. It lunged forward with frightening speed. One by one, it swallowed the serpents of the Egyptian magicians. The court fell silent. Within moments, only one serpent remained. Then it stiffened and turned once again into a wooden staff lying alone on the floor. Moses picked it up. The message should have been clear. The power behind Moses was greater than the power behind the magicians of Egypt. Yet Pharaoh's face remained hard. Scripture says that his heart was hardened. He refused to listen. The confrontation had begun. The next morning, God gave Moses new instructions. Pharaoh would go down to the Nile River early in the day. The Nile was the heart of Egypt. Its waters fed the crops, filled the canals, and sustained the entire nation. Without the Nile, Egypt could not survive. Moses was to meet Pharaoh there at sunrise. The king approached the river with his attendants. Priests were already present, offering prayers to the river god, believing the Nile itself was sacred. Then Moses stepped forward. Aaron stood beside him. Once again, the command was delivered. This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says, "Let my people go, so they may worship me in the wilderness." Pharaoh said nothing. He had heard this demand before. Then Moses lifted the staff toward the river. "By this you will know that the Lord is God." Aaron stepped forward and struck the water of the Nile with the staff. The moment the wood touched the river, the miracle began. The clear flowing water changed before their eyes. It turned red. Deep crimson spread across the surface of the Nile like blood pouring into the current. The color moved through the river channels, into the canals, into the ponds and reservoirs of Egypt. Fish began to die immediately. The smell of death rose into the air as the once pure water became foul and undrinkable. Egyptians rushed to the banks in confusion and horror as the lifeline of their country transformed into something terrifying. Water stored in jars and containers turned the same color. Every source of water in the land seemed to be affected. Panic spread quickly. Servants ran through the streets. Farmers stared helplessly at irrigation canals filled with red liquid. Mothers searched desperately for clean water for their children. The Nile worshipped for centuries as a divine source of life had been struck, and it had failed them. Yet Pharaoh's magicians once again stepped forward. Using their secret arts, they also turned water into blood. Pharaoh saw this and hardened his heart even further. If his magicians could do the same thing, then perhaps the power of Moses was not so unique after all. The king turned away. He returned to his palace as if nothing had happened. For 7 days the Nile remained corrupted. The people of Egypt dug along the riverbanks, searching for clean water beneath the soil. The smell of decay filled the land as dead fish floated along the red currents. But Pharaoh did not change his mind. Then the Lord spoke to Moses again. The next plague was coming. Soon Egypt would face something far more disturbing than poisoned water. Creatures from the river would invade the land itself. They would enter homes. They would fill kitchens. They would crawl across beds. Egypt had mocked the command of God. Now Egypt would begin to tremble. The Nile slowly returned to its natural color, but the memory of what had happened did not fade. For 7 days Egypt had watched the lifeblood of its land become a river of death. The smell of rotting fish had filled the air, and the people had dug desperately in the soil along the riverbanks, searching for water that had not been cursed. Yet Pharaoh had remained unmoved. The king of Egypt had seen the sign, but he had refused to recognize the authority behind it. His heart remained hard, and the empire continued as if nothing had happened. But heaven had only begun to speak. God gave Moses another command. "Go to Pharaoh again," the Lord said. "Tell him, 'Let my people go so they may worship me. If you refuse, I will send frogs across your entire land.'" It sounded almost strange at first. Frogs were not terrifying creatures. They were small animals that lived quietly in the wetlands along the Nile. But God was about to turn something ordinary into a nightmare that would invade every corner of Egyptian life. Once again, Moses and Aaron stood before Pharaoh. The throne room was the same as before, columns rising high into the shadows. Golden statues of Egyptian gods watching from their silent pedestals. Priests and officials gathered around their ruler. Pharaoh looked at the Hebrew brothers with open irritation. "You return again," he said coldly. Aaron spoke the words God had commanded. "This is what the Lord says, 'Let my people go so they may worship me.'" Pharaoh's answer came quickly. No, the decision had already been made in his heart, long before Moses had even entered the room. Then Moses gave the warning. "If you refuse, the Lord will cover Egypt with frogs." Pharaoh laughed. Frogs? The king of Egypt had armies, cities, temples, wealth beyond imagination. He ruled one of the most powerful civilizations in the world. The idea that frogs could threaten his kingdom sounded almost ridiculous. But the next day the Nile began to move. At first it looked like small ripples across the water's surface. Then the banks of the river began to stir as thousands, then tens of thousands of frogs climbed from the water onto the land. They came in waves. They moved through the fields and across the roads. They jumped over irrigation canals and poured into villages. Within hours the frogs were everywhere. They entered the houses of the Egyptians. They crawled into kitchens where food was being prepared. They leapt onto tables and across clay dishes. They filled ovens and cooking bowls. When families opened cupboards, frogs spilled out. They covered the floors of homes like living carpets. Children woke up in the night to find frogs hopping across their beds. Servants swept them away with sticks only to see more appear moments later. The streets echoed with the constant croaking of millions of small voices that never seemed to stop. Even the palace of Pharaoh was not spared. Frogs filled the royal chambers. They appeared beneath the throne and across the polished floors of the court. The servants of the king tried to remove them, but they could not keep up. The entire land of Egypt was overrun. For the first time, Pharaoh began to feel the pressure of something he could not control. Yet once again the magicians of Egypt stepped forward. Through their secret arts they also produced frogs. The miracle of Moses seemed to have a reflection among the magicians, though none of them could actually stop the plague itself. Instead of solving the problem, they only proved that the strange events were real. At last Pharaoh sent for Moses and Aaron. When the two brothers entered the palace again, the king looked far less confident than before. Frogs were still hopping across the marble floors of the royal court as he spoke. "Pray to the Lord," Pharaoh said impatiently. "Ask him to take the frogs away from my people and my land. Then I will let the Israelites go to offer sacrifices." For the first time, the king was negotiating. Moses looked at him calmly. "You may choose the time," Moses said. "When do you want the frogs to disappear?" Pharaoh hesitated for a moment, then answered, "Tomorrow." Moses nodded. "So it will be," he said. "Then you will know that there is no one like the Lord our God." Moses left the palace and cried out to God. The next day the frogs began to die. They died in the houses, they died in the streets, they died in the fields. Soon the Egyptians were gathering them into enormous piles across the land. The smell of decay rose again into the air as the once living plague became mountains of rotting bodies. And when Pharaoh saw that the crisis had ended, his heart hardened again. He changed his mind. The Israelites would not be released. But heaven was not finished. The Lord spoke again to Moses. "Tell Aaron to strike the dust of the ground." Aaron lifted his staff and struck the earth. Immediately the dust of Egypt came alive. Tiny insects rose from the soil in endless clouds. They covered the land, clinging to people and animals alike. They crawled across skin and hair, biting and irritating every living creature. The plague of gnats spread across the nation. For the first time, the magicians of Egypt attempted to copy the miracle and failed. They tried their secret rituals. They spoke their ancient spells, but nothing happened. Finally, the magicians turned to Pharaoh with fear in their eyes. "This is the finger of God," they admitted. Yet Pharaoh still refused to listen. Next came swarms of flies, but something new happened during this plague. The land of Goshen where the Israelites lived remained untouched. The flies filled Egyptian homes and temples, but they did not enter the land of the Hebrew slaves. For the first time, the separation became visible. God was showing Egypt that he was protecting his people even while judgment fell upon the empire. Pharaoh sent for Moses again. "This time you may sacrifice to your God," he said impatiently. "But you must do it here in Egypt." Moses shook his head. "That would not be acceptable to the Lord. We must go into the wilderness." Pharaoh sighed in frustration. "Very well," he said reluctantly. "You may go into the wilderness, but you must not go very far. Now pray for me." Moses left the palace and prayed, and the flies disappeared. But once again Pharaoh hardened his heart. The Israelites were not released. Then a new disaster struck. A terrible disease spread among the livestock of Egypt. Horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, and sheep began to fall sick and die across the land. Fields once filled with animals suddenly stood empty. But once again the livestock of Israel remained untouched. Pharaoh even sent investigators to confirm it. The report returned quickly. Not a single animal belonging to the Israelites had died. Still, Pharaoh would not change his decision. Then Moses took handfuls of soot from a furnace and threw it into the air before Pharaoh. The dust spread across the sky like a cloud. Soon painful boils began to appear on the skin of Egyptians and their animals. The magicians themselves were so afflicted with sores that they could not even stand before Moses anymore. The humiliation of Egypt's spiritual leaders was complete, yet the king of Egypt remained stubborn. His pride was stronger than his fear, but the plagues were not finished. The sky above Egypt began to darken with thunderclouds unlike any the land had seen before. The next sign would fall not from the river, not from the earth, but from the heavens themselves. A storm was coming that would shatter Egypt's confidence forever. The tension across Egypt was becoming unbearable. Each plague had struck deeper than the last, peeling away the illusion that Pharaoh controlled his world. The Nile had turned to blood. Frogs had covered the land. Gnats had risen from the dust itself. Swarms of flies had darkened homes and temples. Livestock had died in the fields. Painful boils had broken out on human skin. Yet even after all of this, Pharaoh still stood firm in his defiance. But heaven was not finished speaking. The God who had sent signs through the river and the earth was now about to speak through the sky. Moses once again entered the palace of Pharaoh, walking past guards who no longer mocked him as they once had. The memory of the plagues had made the court uneasy. Even the servants of Pharaoh had begun to whisper among themselves. Some feared that resisting this God any longer might bring disaster upon them all. Still, Pharaoh remained on his throne. Moses stood before him and delivered the next message. "This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. Let my people go so they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go and continue to hold them back, the full power of my plagues will fall upon you, your officials, and your people." The words echoed through the throne room. But Moses did not stop there. For by now, he continued, "I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with a plague that would have wiped you off the earth. But I have raised you up for this very purpose, to show you my power so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth." Pharaoh's eyes narrowed. This was no longer merely a confrontation between a king and a prophet. It was a confrontation between pride and authority, between the throne of Egypt and the God of heaven. Then Moses gave a warning unlike any before it. "Tomorrow at this time," he said, "the Lord will send the worst hailstorm that has ever fallen on Egypt from the day it was founded until now." The court grew silent. Egypt was a land where rain itself was rare. Hailstorms were almost unheard of. The idea that a storm powerful enough to destroy an entire nation could appear overnight seemed impossible. Yet Moses continued, "Give an order now to bring your livestock and everything you have in the field to a place of shelter, because the hail will fall on every person and animal that has not been brought in and is still out in the field." It was not just a warning, it was mercy. For the first time during the plagues, God was giving the Egyptians an opportunity to protect themselves. Some of Pharaoh's officials had begun to take these warnings seriously. They had seen too much to dismiss Moses as a madman. They had watched plague after plague strike the land exactly as he had said, and so some of them hurried away from the palace. They rushed to their homes and fields, ordering their servants to bring animals inside and gather workers under shelter before the coming storm. But others laughed. They had seen strange things. Yes, but a storm from heaven that could destroy Egypt. That was too much to believe. They ignored the warning. The next day the sky began to change. Dark clouds rolled across the horizon, heavier than anything the Egyptians had ever seen. The air thickened with tension. The wind began to rise. Moses lifted his staff toward the heavens. Then the storm came. Thunder exploded across the sky like the roar of a war between worlds. Lightning flashed again and again, striking the earth with terrifying force. But what followed was something Egypt had never witnessed before. Hail began to fall. At first it struck the ground like scattered stones. Then the storm intensified. Great chunks of ice crashed down from the sky with devastating power. The hail smashed crops, shattered trees, and struck the ground with a violence that terrified everyone who saw it. Fields were destroyed in moments. Plants that had survived the earlier plagues were crushed beneath the storm. Branches snapped from trees. Roofs cracked under the impact. Anyone caught outside was in mortal danger. Men and animals who had ignored the warning fell beneath the hail as it rained down from the sky. The storm was so fierce that lightning ran through the hail itself, fire flashing among the falling ice as thunder roared overhead. Across Egypt the destruction spread like a wave. But in the land of Goshen where the Israelites lived there was no hail. The sky above them remained clear. It was a division so obvious that no one could deny it. Egypt was under judgment. Israel was under protection. Pharaoh could ignore the signs no longer. He sent for Moses and Aaron immediately. When they arrived at the palace, Pharaoh looked shaken. The thunder still echoed in the distance as the storm continued to rage. "This time I have sinned," Pharaoh admitted. The words shocked everyone in the court. "The Lord is in the right," he continued, "and I and my people are in the wrong." For the first time, the king of Egypt had spoken words that sounded like confession. "Pray to the Lord," he said urgently. "We have had enough thunder and hail. I will let you go. You do not have to stay any longer." Moses looked at him carefully. He had seen Pharaoh promise things before, but Moses answered calmly, "When I have gone out of the city, I will spread out my hands in prayer to the Lord. The thunder will stop, and there will be no more hail. So you will know that the earth belongs to the Lord." Then Moses added quietly, "But I know that you and your officials still do not fear the Lord God." Those words hung in the air like a shadow. Moses left the palace and walked out beyond the city walls. The storm still raged above him, lightning tearing through the sky. He raised his hands toward heaven, and the storm stopped. The thunder faded. The hail ceased. The clouds slowly parted. Egypt stood silent beneath a shattered sky. Fields were ruined, trees were broken, crops lay destroyed across the land. It was the worst storm the nation had ever experienced. Yet even after witnessing such power, Pharaoh's heart hardened once again when he saw that the rain, hail, and thunder had stopped. He sinned again. He and his officials returned to their stubborn defiance. The Israelites would not go. The war between heaven and Egypt was not over. And the next plague would come not from the sky but from the wind, a wind that would carry something far more terrifying than hail, a living cloud that would devour what little remained of Egypt's land. After the storm passed, Egypt stood wounded but still proud. The hail had shattered trees, destroyed crops, and killed those who had ignored the warning. Yet Pharaoh had returned to the same decision he had made from the beginning. The Israelites would not go free. The palace once again became a place of stubborn silence, where the king pretended that the power he had just witnessed did not truly threaten him. But the devastation outside the palace walls told another story. Egypt had never experienced such disasters. The river had turned to blood. The land had crawled with frogs and gnats. Flies had filled the houses. Animals had died. Painful boils had struck the people. And the storm had torn through the nation like the anger of heaven. And still Pharaoh refused. Yet something had begun to change inside Egypt itself. The people could feel it. Even the officials who served the king had begun to fear what might happen next. Each plague had grown more severe than the last. Each sign had revealed a power greater than the gods carved into the temples of Egypt. And now another command came from the Lord. Moses returned to Pharaoh once again. The journey to the palace had become almost familiar. The guards no longer mocked him. The courtiers no longer whispered insults when he entered the halls. Instead, there was uneasiness in their eyes. They had seen too much. They had watched the predictions of Moses come true again and again. Some of them had even begun to wonder whether resisting the God of Israel was slowly destroying their nation. Before Moses even spoke, some of Pharaoh's own officials approached the king with desperate words. "How long will this man be a snare to us?" they asked. "Let the people go so they may worship their God. Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined?" It was a remarkable moment. The advisors of Pharaoh, men who had once trusted completely in the power of their king, were now begging him to surrender. Pharaoh hesitated. For the first time, doubt entered the throne room. He ordered Moses and Aaron to be brought before him again. When the two brothers stood before him, Pharaoh spoke with forced calm. "Go and worship the Lord your God," he said. "But tell me who will be going." It sounded like permission, but it was really a test. Moses answered without hesitation. "We will go with our young and our old, with our sons and our daughters, and with our flocks and herds, because we must celebrate a festival to the Lord." Pharaoh's face hardened. "The Lord be with you if I ever let you go with your women and children," he snapped. "Clearly you are bent on evil. No. Only the men may go and worship the Lord, since that is what you have been asking for." With that, he ordered them driven out of his presence. Pharaoh was trying to compromise. He was willing to release part of the people, but not all of them. He was willing to appear cooperative while still maintaining control. But God had not asked for negotiation. God had demanded freedom. After Moses left the palace, the Lord spoke again. "Stretch out your hand over Egypt so that locusts swarm over the land and devour everything growing in the fields, everything left by the hail." Moses raised his staff. Soon a wind began to blow from the east. At first it seemed harmless, a steady desert wind moving across the land, but it did not stop. It blew through the day and through the night, carrying something unseen across the horizon. By morning the sky had changed. A dark cloud appeared in the distance. But it was not a storm. It was alive. The cloud moved closer until the Egyptians could see what it was: millions upon millions of locusts, their wings beating like a living storm across the sky. They descended upon Egypt. The insects covered the land so thickly that the ground seemed to move beneath them. They filled the air, covering every plant, every field, every tree that had survived the earlier plagues. The sound of their wings was like a constant roaring wind. Within hours they began to eat. Anything green that remained after the hail disappeared beneath their hunger. Crops vanished. Leaves were stripped from trees. Even the bark of branches was chewed away. The land that had once been rich and fertile became barren before the eyes of its people. Egypt had never seen anything like it. By the time the locusts finished, nothing green remained. Fields stood empty. Trees were bare. The land looked as if fire had passed over it. Panic spread across Egypt. Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron in haste. When they arrived, the king spoke quickly, his confidence gone. "I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you," he said. "Now forgive my sin once more and pray to the Lord your God to take this deadly plague away from me." Moses left the palace and prayed. The Lord sent a powerful west wind that swept the locusts away, carrying them toward the Red Sea until not a single insect remained in Egypt. But once again, as soon as relief came, Pharaoh hardened his heart. The Israelites were not allowed to leave. That moment, something changed in the pattern of the plagues. Until now, each disaster had given Egypt some form of warning or chance to respond, but the next sign would come suddenly and silently, without negotiation. God told Moses to lift his hand toward the sky. "Stretch out your hand toward heaven," the Lord said, "so that darkness spreads over Egypt, darkness that can be felt." Moses raised his hand, and the light disappeared. At first it looked like the approach of evening, but the darkness deepened quickly, swallowing the sky and the land together. The sun, which Egyptians worshipped as one of their greatest gods, vanished completely. The darkness became so thick that it seemed to press against the skin. People could not see one another. No one left their homes. For 3 days Egypt remained trapped in this strange and terrifying night. No torches could fully drive it away. The land that had once been filled with sunlight now felt like a prison of shadow. But in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, there was light. The contrast was undeniable. Egypt lived in darkness. Israel lived in light. After 3 days, Pharaoh could endure no more. He summoned Moses again. "Go, worship the Lord," Pharaoh said with frustration. "Even your women and children may go with you. Only leave your flocks and herds behind." It was another compromise. Pharaoh was still trying to keep control of something. But Moses answered firmly, "You must allow us to have sacrifices and burnt offerings to present to the Lord our God. Our livestock too must go with us. Not a hoof is to be left behind. We have to use some of them in worshiping the Lord our God." The tension inside the throne room exploded. Pharaoh's anger returned like a storm. "Get out of my sight," he shouted. "Make sure you do not appear before me again. The day you see my face, you will die." Moses stood calmly before the most powerful king in the world. "You have spoken correctly," he said quietly. "I will never appear before you again." The confrontation had reached its final stage. One more plague remained, a plague unlike any that had come before. It would not attack crops, it would not strike animals. It would enter every Egyptian home, and by morning, Egypt would never be the same again. The confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh had reached its final moment. 9 plagues had swept across Egypt like waves of judgment, each one more devastating than the last. The Nile had turned to blood. Frogs had filled homes and temples. Gnats had risen from the dust. Flies had darkened the air. Livestock had died in the fields. Boils had tormented the people. Hail had shattered crops and trees. Locusts had devoured everything that remained. And finally, a darkness so deep that it could be felt had covered the entire nation for 3 days. Yet Pharaoh still refused. The throne of Egypt had become a fortress of pride, and Pharaoh's heart had hardened against every warning. Even after his own officials begged him to surrender, even after the land itself seemed to collapse under the weight of disaster, the king would not release the Israelites. But God had already declared that one final sign would come, a sign that would end the struggle forever. After leaving Pharaoh's palace for the last time, Moses carried a message to the people of Israel. The instructions he gave were unlike anything they had ever heard before. It was not simply preparation for another plague, it was preparation for deliverance. Moses told every family to choose a lamb. The animal had to be perfect, without defect, a male, 1-year-old. On the 10th day of the month, each household was to select the lamb and keep it until the 14th day. The entire community of Israel would then slaughter their lambs at twilight. But the most important part of the command came next. The blood of the lamb was to be placed on the doorposts in the top of the doorway of each house. Inside those homes, the families would roast the lamb and eat it together. They were to eat it with bitter herbs and unleavened bread, dressed for travel with sandals on their feet and staffs in their hands. They were to eat in haste. For that night, something terrible and something miraculous was about to happen. God spoke these words through Moses. "On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals. I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord." The message was terrifying. But there was also protection. "The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are," God said. "And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt." It was a moment of faith. The Israelites had to trust that obedience would save them. Across the land of Goshen, families began preparing their homes exactly as Moses had instructed. Lambs were chosen. Bread was made quickly without yeast. Doorposts were marked with blood. The atmosphere was heavy with expectation. For generations, the Israelites had lived as slaves in Egypt. They had built its cities, worked its fields, and carried its burdens. Many of them had never known freedom, but tonight felt different. Tonight felt like the edge of something that had been promised long ago. As darkness fell across Egypt, 2 very different scenes unfolded across the land. In Egyptian homes, life continued as usual. The people had grown used to strange disasters, but the sky was clear now. The darkness had lifted. There was no storm, no insects, no river of blood. For the first time in weeks, the land felt quiet. But in the homes of Israel, families gathered together in silence. They ate the meal of the lamb exactly as they had been told. Their staffs rested beside them. Their cloaks were wrapped around their shoulders. They were waiting. Midnight approached. The entire nation of Egypt slept. Then it happened. In the deepest part of the night, the Lord passed through the land. No army marched across the fields. No thunder shook the sky. The judgment came silently. And in every Egyptian household, tragedy struck. From the palace of Pharaoh to the smallest home of a servant, the firstborn sons of Egypt died. Even the firstborn of livestock perished in the fields and barns. The cry that rose across the land was unlike anything Egypt had ever heard. It was a cry of grief, a cry of terror, a cry that echoed from city to village, from palace to prison. There was not a single Egyptian home without death. Inside the palace, Pharaoh himself faced the devastation. His own firstborn son, the heir to the throne of Egypt, was gone. The king who had defied the God of Israel now stood powerless before him. In the middle of the night, Pharaoh sent for Moses and Aaron. His voice, once filled with command, now carried the weight of defeat. "Up, leave my people," he said. "You and the Israelites go worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you have said and go." Then he added something unexpected, "And also bless me." Egypt was desperate for the Israelites to leave. The people urged them to go quickly. fearing that more destruction might follow if they stayed. The Israelites gathered their belongings in haste. Their dough had not yet risen, so they carried it wrapped in cloth on their shoulders. They also did something Moses had instructed them to do beforehand. They asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. In their fear and grief, the Egyptians gave them whatever they asked. The slaves who had built Egypt were leaving not as beggars, but with wealth in their hands. That night, after more than 400 years in Egypt, the people of Israel began their journey out of slavery. Men, women, children, and livestock moved together in a massive procession across the land. The number of people was enormous, hundreds of thousands, perhaps more than 1 million when families were counted. The road ahead was uncertain. The desert waited beyond the borders of Egypt, but something remarkable guided them. As they left, the Lord went before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, leading them along the path they should take. For the first time in generations, the people of Israel were free, yet the journey of Moses was far from over. Ahead of them lay the Red Sea, where Pharaoh's army would make one final attempt to stop their escape. Beyond that would be the wilderness, where Moses would lead the people through trials, miracles, rebellion, and revelation. And on a mountain called Sinai, the man who once stood barefoot before a burning bush would stand again before the presence of God. But the night of the Passover would never be forgotten, for it was the night when judgment passed over those who were marked by the blood, the night when slaves walked out of the greatest empire on earth, and the night when the world learned that the God who spoke from the burning bush was stronger than any king who sat on a throne.